Okay, we're picking up with Matthew chapter 7 tonight. And what I would like to do is just begin by doing some reading, and then we will begin to talk about the text. Matthew 7 1 through 12 is what we can cover tonight. So, uh, let's just get started by reading the text together. Matthew 7, starting in verse 1. Do not judge, so that you will not be judged. For in the way you judge, you will be judged. And by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, and behold, the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. Do not give what is holy to dogs, and do not throw your pearls before swine, or they will trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks it will be opened. Or what man is there among you who, when his son asks for a loaf, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, he will not give him a snake, will he? If you then, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give what is good to those who ask him? In everything, therefore, treat people the same way you want them to treat you, for this is the law and the prophets. Matthew chapter 7 and verse 1 marks another shift in the Sermon on the Mount. And it is what I outline still as part of the conduct section of the sermon, but it is a shift away from the the storing up treasure, Matthew 6:19. No man can serve two masters. Um, Seek first the kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. It is a marked shift from the last section of Matthew chapter 6. And so it has caused some to speculate, and it is entirely and wholly speculation about whether or not these paragraphs, and there are three of them, I think, Matthew 7, 1 through 1 through 5, verse 6 somewhat stands alone, and then 7 through 11, and we'll talk about 12 too. But um, there are at least three distinct paragraphs in what we've read, if not four, and they are very different in their content. And I think they even seem somewhat unrelated to one another. One of the criticisms that has been leveled against this is that it's disjointed. And so it's caused some to speculate, and it is speculation, that these aren't original to the sermon, that they're other statements of Jesus that he spoke on other occasions, and Matthew just sort of randomly attaches them here. Well, that's speculative at best, and it's an unwarranted attack on the accuracy of Matthew's record of the sermon. And so there's no reason to doubt it. And what I want to try to do tonight is to show, I think, how these thoughts in Matthew 7, 1 through 12, relate to the rest of the sermon. So, one of the things that I think Jesus is doing here is he is providing some balance to the rest of the sermon, and he is offering some admonitions some warnings toward those who might indeed hear and take to heart everything else he has said in the sermon. And so um, Jesus is offering some cautionary words here. In other words, just because you understand kingdom righteousness, just because you understand everything else that I've preached in this sermon, Matthew 5 and 6, that doesn't give you a reason to be harsh in your judgment, hypocritical in your condemnation of others who don't understand what you understand. And so you need to be careful about your judgment. Second, in your zeal about the righteousness that you have learned, you want to share that with others. And that's a good thing. But you need to realize that not everyone is going to receive that. Not everyone is going to understand the value of this teaching, and not everyone is going to um, to crave it as you crave. You need to be warned about the different responses that you may get. That's Matthew 7, verse 6. The kingdom that that Jesus is describing here is uh, not obtained by your own heroic righteousness. It's not a matter of merit. It's not a matter of what you deserve. Even when you have done everything that Jesus says in this sermon, to borrow Jesus' language from other places, you are still an unprofitable servant. The kingdom, the righteousness that Jesus describes, is one that is given in response to asking, seeking, and knocking. It is still a gift of God's love, not something you deserve because of your perfect righteousness. And so these admonitions in Matthew 7 1 through 11 provide caution. They are warnings to those who might receive the other teaching that Jesus has done. Jesus wants to make sure that they do not react to that teaching inappropriately. And so I think there is very much a connection between what Jesus teaches here and everything that goes before it. I think it fits just extraordinarily well and is really a much needed part of the sermon. Now we're going to go back and look at each of these paragraphs individually. We're going to go back and I'm going to ask someone to reread each of these sections and for us to talk about them. But I wanted to take the first few minutes of our class tonight and just try to see them again, try to get the big picture. I know you all get tired of me talking about the big picture, but try to back up and see how this fits the overall context of the sermon and how it relates to everything else. I want to try to do that first before we kind of get lost in the details of this text. Does that make sense to everyone? Do you see the relation of these ideas to the rest of the sermon? Does anybody have something they want to add to that or a question that they want to ask about it? Okay. Well, let's do as I just mentioned, let's go back and let's read each of these sections by itself and talk a little bit more about it. So, Tom, I'm going to get you to start reading for us tonight. If you will, Matthew 7 1 through 5, please.
Judge not that ye be not judged. For with what judgment ye judge, ye shall be judged, and with what measure ye meet, it shall be measured to you again. And why beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye, but considerest not the beam that is in thine own eye? Or how wilt thou say to thy brother, let me pull out the mote out of thine eye, and behold, a beam is in thine own eye? Thou hypocrite, first cast out the beam of thine own eye, and then shalt thou see clearly to cast out the mote out of thy brother's eye.
All right, thank you for reading. So, Jesus here speaks of judgment, and Matthew 7 verse 1 ranks among probably the top 5, maybe top 3 most well-known but misunderstood verses of the Bible. If you were going to make a list of verses that are oft quoted but little understood, this would probably rank right up there. John 3:16, you know, probably at the top of that list. John chapter 8, let him who is without sin cast the first stone. You would probably come up with others on your own list. But judge not that ye be not judged. So my question is Jesus offering a blanket condemnation of all judgment? Is that what Jesus offers here in Matthew 7, 1 through 5?
No.
All right. Then explain what he's saying here, Brian.
I think
this is what happens when you speak up first. Then you have to talk more. All right, Brian.
I think it's summarized best in verse 5. He's talking about hypocritical judgment, an example that he gives.
Okay. And I think that is exactly right. You cannot isolate verse 1 from its context. Do not judge so that you will not be judged. Okay. If that verse were itself the only verse in the context, or if it were the only verse in the Bible that spoke to the matter of judgment, then we could make that argument. But the fact of the matter is, Jesus says in the very next verse, for in the way that you judge, that assumes that there is going to be judgment that we have to make. And he clarifies, you will be judged by the standard you use. And as Brian said, this is a condemnation of hypocritical judgment. You all know that I like to read what Brother Paul Earnhardt has written, particularly his writings about the Sermon on the Mount. And I want to share with you something that he wrote about this particular section. He said, our Lord's point is that people who are so much in need of mercy have no business being so merciless to others. Now, I can't think of a better summary. We don't get to hold others to a standard that we're not willing to hold ourselves to. We don't get to ignore our own sin and yet be critical of the sins of others. Now, again, Jesus would say in another place, judge righteous judgment. Judge fairly, judge what is right, be just, judge as the Lord would judge. There are too many other passages that speak of admonishing others, rebuking others, correcting others, to suggest that we have no business doing that. But we cannot be hypocritical in that process. We cannot be more critical of others than we are of ourselves. And so we'll deal with ourselves first. Now, that's not saying sinless perfection. It is saying, as I think we read in other passages, what the Bible calls blamelessness. Again, that's not sinless perfection, but that is to say that there is nothing which can presently be laid to our charge, that we have, we've dealt with the sin, and we are not going to hold others accountable to a standard we ourselves are unwilling, by which we ourselves are unwilling to abide. All right. What else about this first 5 verses?
Couple of passages that I guess always think of. John 7, I think 24, we're told to judge a righteous judgment.
Right.
And what is Acts 16? Lydia says to Paul, if you judge me to be faithful, come into my house. So to your point, judgments, discernments are going to have to be rendered.
That's right. And sin is going to have to be condemned. It's not just a matter of making decisions about certain things, but it is about speaking out against sin. The implication, if you've judged me to be faithful, you use the example of Lydia in Acts chapter 16. Well, if Paul had not judged her to be faithful, do you think Paul was just gonna proceed without calling that to her attention? That's certainly not the example that we see of him in other contexts. How is that loving? How is that concern for the welfare of another's soul? And so again, this is not a prohibition of judgment, but it is an admonition to mercy. It is an admonition to meekness and spiritual humility in the process, and a warning against hypocrisy. All right. Anybody else about those first 5 verses? Now, when I ask the question, is this an absolute prohibition of judgment? Another thing that answers that question for us is verse 6. Brian, will you read verse 6 for us, please?
Do not give what is holy to the dogs, nor cast your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet and turn and tear you in pieces.
Let me ask you, how do you abide by the teaching of that verse without exercising judgment about who might be dogs and who are swine? I mean, that requires a judgment. And, we all, well, I say we all, most of us probably like dogs, at least some dogs, maybe most dogs. But, Jesus here isn't talking about, cute, cuddly poodles that lick your face and curl up in your lap. He's talking about mongrel rogue dogs. I don't know of any passage of scripture in the Bible that uses the term dogs in a complimentary way. Certainly not swine to a Jewish audience in particular. And so there's nothing good about this. And if I'm going to refrain from giving what is holy to dogs, that means I have to know who's a dog. If I'm going to keep from casting pearls before swine, I've got to be able to identify swine. And that's that is hard language that requires us making a judgment. Now, when he says, don't give what is holy to dogs and don't cast your pearls before swine, is he talking about literal dogs, literal pearls, literal swine? Is Jesus concerned for, how you handle things down on the farm? Is that what Jesus is talking about here?
No.
All right, what's he talking about?
I think, could this be tied in? And then the book, chapter, and verse has slipped me, but about when we're told to, how is it put, cast off the dust of our feet and move. Is this similar to that?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
In teaching, and if you just teach and teach and they don't accept it, and there's a time when you got to pick another student, I guess you could say.
No, I think that is exactly that is exactly right. Um, the context that I think of that statement, to shake the dust off your feet and move on.
Yeah.
When Jesus sent out his disciples on a limited commission, Matthew chapter 10, verse 14. Whoever does not receive you nor heed your words as you go out of that house or that city, shake the dust off your feet.
Yeah.
And then later in that same context, verse 23, but whenever they persecute you in one city, flee to the next. For truly I say to you, you will not finish going through the cities of Israel until the Son of Man comes. And so I think that principle is exactly right, Tom. I think that's the connection. And so the idea here of taking what is holy and giving it to dogs, I think that imagery is drawn from the holy things of the temple or before that tabernacle altar. You remember that things offered um, at the temple or before that the tabernacle, that there were portions of at least some of the sacrifices that belonged to the priest and the Levites, those who served at the altar, and those things were holy. There was the showbread, or the bread of the presence, that wasn't to be eaten by just anyone. That was holy. It was to be eaten by the priest. And so you don't take what is holy and give it to dogs. You don't take the holy food of the altar or the table of the bread from the table of showbread and just cast it out like so much garbage for the dogs to pick through. You don't do that. And no reverent Jew would ever dream of doing that. You wouldn't take a pearl. This reminds you of Jesus in Matthew, Matthew 13, where he's speaking in parables. I think it's Matthew 13, where he talks about the pearl of great price. Yeah, that's Matthew 13, 45 and 46, and talking about the value of the kingdom. Well, you wouldn't take something as valuable as a pearl, and you wouldn't throw that out in a pig trough or in the pig pen, as the case would be. They have no concept of that value. They couldn't possibly care less about something as valuable as pearls. You wouldn't do that. Jesus is obviously using a hyperbole here. He's using extreme examples. And so to your point, Tom, the application is that there are going to be those who by their behavior uh, judge themselves unworthy of the kingdom, unworthy of the gospel. that they have no interest in it. And despite what ought to be our zeal in teaching the gospel to everyone with whom we have an opportunity, that doesn't mean that you keep preaching it or keep teaching it, keep offering it to those who have no interest in it, who reject it, who would treat it in such an irreverent, disrespectful, ungrateful kind of way. And that requires judgment. And that's a hard decision to reach. It's hard to come to the conclusion, I'm casting what is holy before dogs. I'm casting pearls before swine. I need to shake the dust off my feet and move on. Especially when we're dealing with somebody with whom we have a personal relationship as a family or a family member or friend or a classmate or a coworker, a neighbor, someone that we deeply care for and we really want to see them do better spiritually and have spiritual hope. That's what we want for them. And yet they're just not interested. Well, we have to make difficult decisions in those cases. Right? Anybody have anything they want to add to that discussion?
I guess the time when each individual not literally, but shakes the dust off their feet, I guess that's a decision each of us have to make, but you have to watch because it can be discouraging.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. We have to be careful on both sides of that, I think, that we're not too quick to reach that decision, and neither are we too slow to reach that decision. And that is a very delicate balancing act. And I would just suggest that if we, particularly in cases where it does involve someone with whom we are closely connected and there is an emotional connection, it's probably time to involve a third party. It's probably time to bring in someone who can be a little bit more objective and who can help us with that. And so whoever that may be, someone of spiritual maturity that you trust, that understands these principles, I would suggest that that would be a healthy thing.
Sometimes they'll make that decision for you, though.
Absolutely. Yeah. Sometimes.
A friend of mine at work, I was talking to him, and he was Episcopal. He just finally told me, just we're at an impasse, and let's just drop it. So
absolutely. I've had the same experience. And that's a very painful thing, but that does sometimes happen. Now, there is an additional element to that, and that is Jesus warns here in Matthew 7 verse 6 that sometimes the rejection is not just passive but even violent. Not only will they trample pearls under their feet, but then turn and tear you to pieces. And this reminds us of what Jesus said earlier in the sermon in Matthew 12. Blessed are those who have been persecuted for righteousness' sake. Blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. That's even more painful. To have your name, your character, your reputation slandered, or even if not in any kind of public or widespread way, for hurtful things to be said about you, particularly when you have a personal relationship with those with whom you are trying to reason about the kingdom and about kingdom righteousness. But Jesus warns that that can happen. And my friend Jim Deason has said, and you've heard me say this before, there's no way to skin a cat in the way that the cat's gonna like it. And that's a rather crude and maybe unsavory way to describe it. But there's not really a way to tell someone they are wrong in a way that they're going to like that. Now, there are better ways than not. There are some ways you can do it more tactfully, diplomatically, in a way as to reason and win the soul, not just win the argument. There are ways to do that. But ultimately, the gospel convicts concerning sin and righteousness and the kingdom. And it is the sword of the Spirit. And in some cases, it's going to be an Acts 2 case where it is going to cut to the heart and people are going to be moved to repentance and obedience. And in other cases, it's going to be an Acts 7 experience where men are cut to the heart and they lashed out at Stephen and gnashed at him with their teeth. It's going to cut. And some are going to be cut in a humbling way, and some are going to be cut into in a violent way. Another friend of mine says the gospel either makes someone better or it makes them bitter. And honestly, there's not a lot in between. And so we have to be prepared for that. And so as we, to kind of bring this discussion back full circle, as we understand the gospel of the kingdom, the righteousness Jesus describes in his Sermon on the Mount, the natural response of a humble spiritual heart that is made better by it, we want to share that with others. And we need to do that. But we need to make sure that in doing it, we're not hypocritical or merciless. And we need to understand the challenges that we're going to face in that process. And make sure that we are not wasting our time. That we are seeking out those who have ears to hear and those whose hearts are prepared to receive the gospel. The gospel is, as verses 7 through 11 suggest, the gospel is therefore the asking, seeking, and knocking. The language of Matthew 7 through 11 is used in other contexts. For example, Luke chapter 11, and applied to the subject of prayer. But I don't think that's how Jesus is using this language here. I'm not denying that it has application to prayer. I'm suggesting I don't think that's what Jesus is saying in this context. I think he's talking about the kingdom. It's not a kingdom to be taken by violence. It's not a kingdom that we're going to force ourselves into. It's not a kingdom that we get to take just because we're, quote, good enough. It's a kingdom and a relationship with God that he offers for those who seek it on his terms. So I'm about out of time for tonight. And so we'll pick up with that thought in that section, Lord willing, next week. Thank you all for studying together tonight. I appreciate your participation and your continued patience with this forum. I hope that this study is still beneficial to you. I hope it's a good encouragement to you in the middle of the week. Look forward to seeing everybody on Sunday morning in person, Lord willing. Good night, everybody. Have a great rest of the week.